This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at NCSL's Broadband Briefing with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. I'm Representative Aaron Ling Johansson from Hawaii, and I'm co-chair of the NCSL's Communications, Financial, and Interstate Commerce Committee. I'm also proud to be joined by my fellow co-chair, Representative Adam Koenig from Kentucky. In November of 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law, a historic investment in America's roads, bridges, ports, broadband, water infrastructure, and cybersecurity. Today, we're honored to have two representatives from NTIA with us to give an overview of the broadband programs included in the law and to have a conversation about how NTIA can best work with states to implement those programs efficiently. This discussion is being recorded, and we will have an open discussion after the formal presentation where members can ask our speakers questions and give feedback on questions that NTIA has. This briefing is for legislators and staff only, so if you are on the call but not a legislator or staff, please kindly exit the call. Now I'll turn it over to Representative Koenig to introduce our speakers. Representative Koenig.
Thank you, Representative Johansson. Joining us this afternoon is Doug Kinkoff, Associate Administrator for NTIA's Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth. Doug first joined the Department of Commerce in 2010, and in his current role as Associate Administrator is responsible for implementing the broadband programs included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Prior to joining the Commerce Department, Doug served in multiple executive roles in the communications industry with companies such as SoundPath Conferencing, XO Communication, and others. Doug, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to provide to you today an overview of the IIJA, or we'll call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It's a little shorter, the bill. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through each of the four programs that the IIJA or bill has bestowed upon NTIA. Next slide, please. Get to the first overview here. Okay, so the Infrastructure Jobs Act provided $65 billion in broadband funding. $48 billion of this funding comes to NTIA, $42.45 billion for the infrastructure program, $2.75 billion for the digital equity program, $1 billion for middle mile, and $2 billion for tribal. And I'll go into deeper dives on all of these in a moment. The remaining funding went to the Fcc at $14.2 billion for their affordable connectivity program, which is a program that provides a $30 subsidy and $75 tribal land subsidy. USDA will receive $2 billion for additional funding under their Reconnect programs, and then there's $600 million for state and local governments to pursue through the Treasury, through private activity bonds. Next slide, please. So the quick overview of the BEAD program. Again, it is a $42.45 billion program. And the BEAD is Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And
the scheme changed.
It is targeted to state and territory via a formula. And that formula is the number of unserved locations in a state, which will be determined via the new Fcc Maps
that was in the Book of Mormon.
Will be available later on. And the intent of this, right, is to ensure the administration's goal of connecting 100% of Americans is achieved. This is the physical infrastructure portion of the funding. Program priorities are: one, first, states should pursue unserved locations, those with no access to 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. After they've ensured that the plan will connect all unserved locations, they can then look at underserved locations. Those are at 25.3, between 25.3 and less than 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up. And then the third priority is community anchored institutions that do not have a 1 gigabit connection. State programs must also prioritize persistent areas of poverty, speed of the proposed network. It must have a minimum speed of 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up. And we want the subrecipients, those that are selected by the state to implement the network builds throughout their states that are deemed qualified, to have a demonstrated record of compliance with federal labor and employment laws. There is a 25% match obligation with this program that can be provided through various forms. It can be cash, which could be utilized. You can utilize current, like the ARPA funding and other federal funding that is set forth in legislation. So you can rob Peter to pay Paul a little bit to take care of this. The state can pay it, political subdivisions can pay it, carriers can pay it. It's also not just cash, it can be through in-kind contributions. For example, if you were building out a network in your community and you provided access to water towers or other type of features for deployment of, let's say, a wireless network, then those could be contributed as part of an in-kind contribution. And there's a way to validate the value of that asset. And then each area that accepts funding, so for every carrier that accepts funding to build out the unserved areas, they are required to offer a low-cost plan to eligible subscribers. And we, NTIA, will build the framework for that in the notice of funding. And then the state and NTIA will work together on that. The notice of funding opportunity, which is the rules that get released regarding this, are targeted for May 16th. Next slide, please. There's also $2.75 billion for digital equity, which is a very large sum of money for digital equity and one that is greatly needed. There are 3 programs that make up this 2.75. The first is a $60 million state planning grant program, which will be launched on or around like the first couple weeks in June. It has a little bit different timeline based on the legislation. There's also a state capacity grant program that will come after that, and that will be the funding that will allow the state to implement, and then there's a competitive grant program. The plans are, the state will basically notify NTIA. It's not going to be a difficult process to get their share of the $60 million, which again is based on a formula. And we're working on that formula now based on the legislation. But basically, states will notify us which state organization or agency will be running it, and basically that they want to participate. It will be fairly simple. And then states will have up to a year to build out their state digital equity plan. And near the end of that year, we will then launch a state capacity grant program. So you can see the program priorities here, right? We're targeting digital equity to basically vulnerable populations, veterans, aging individuals, incarcerated individuals that is not federally incarcerated. If I recall right, individuals with disabilities, so certain racial or ethnic minority groups, which have historically lagged behind in adoption and use of the internet. And then individuals that primarily reside in a rural area. Next slide, please. So once the planning grants are out, the state will take up to a year to develop their plan. In order to be eligible for this state capacity grant program of $1.44 billion in total funding pool, you have to engage in the planning portion that I just talked about. So a state has to develop a plan and bring it to NTIA in order to be eligible for this next leg of the funding. Again, this is will be the same formula based that we developed for the planning based on for states and territories. And then basically we will approve or accept your plan. You will make a request, we'll do the formula, and then you'll get X amount of dollars, so be determined, to go out and basically deploy your digital equity plan. Funding for this, for the capacity portion of this, is annual. And there's funding set aside for 5 years in the legislation. So every year you would come back and seek another tranche of money to continue to deploy your digital equity plan. Next slide, please. And then Congress also set aside $1.25 billion for a competitive digital equity program. This is open to, as you can see here, this is not all, but basically a very large subset of entities that can apply. A state can apply for this also, political subdivisions, tribals, organizations, Native Americans, Alaska, Hawaiian are eligible to apply for this. This is a competitive grant program, and I would expect it to be highly oversubscribed, as we have seen on our current programs of, on average, almost a factor of 10 for our current tribal plan was oversubscribed by, the requested funding was $6 billion on a $1 billion program. Right? Our infrastructure state program was oversubscribed by a factor of 10, $2.8 billion requests for $288 million in funding availability. So I do expect this, all of these programs, but the competitive ones to be highly oversubscribed. So I do believe, though, this is an area where political subdivisions, because have an opportunity to seek funding directly. The digital equity planning that I mentioned in the capacity planning and the BEAD program are all funded to the state, and then the state will engage, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit about how they will work with political subdivisions, et cetera. This one is competitive. So any of these eligibility entities listed here can come forth with a plan. We will then basically do our analysis and our reviews and slate based on the best awards, the biggest impact, and then we will make those awards. Next slide, please. NTIA currently has a tribal program underway. It's a $1 billion program. We have started to roll out awards, and we will do that through spring, and then that first $1 billion of funding will be out the door. Congress in the IIJA provided another $2 billion on top of that to fund additional applications in the current program, or to establish a new notice of funding for a second round. And NTIA is currently evaluating how it will address the new $2 billion. I could anticipate NTIA using some of this $2 billion for its current program to fund many of the great applications we've received, but also leaving significant money for a second notice of funding so that tribal entities that were not able to participate in the first round would have an opportunity through with the new money. Congress also made some changes to the time requirements, which were very tight under the first program, and have basically doubled them or beyond, giving more time to file. So on the first program, tribes had 90 days to develop and file an application with a new program for the first time. That's gone to 6 months. We had 6 months to commit funds. Now it's 18 months, and we went from 1 year to 4 years on expending the grant funds. So that will be very beneficial to the tribes, as well as increasing from 2% to 2.5%, the amount of cost, the percentage of the funding that they get that can be used for planning and feasibility studies, et cetera. Next slide, please. So the final program that is in the new IIJ legislation was the $1 billion middle mile. And this, again, is a competitive grant program. So any state, political subdivision, combination of that and or with providers can seek funding under this. And really the intent of the middle mile is to help reduce the cost of connecting unserved and underserved areas that are currently lacking broadband. So, right, if we can make strong grants in the middle mile using this $1 billion for middle mile, that will reduce the cost for the business model to connect last mile homes and businesses that are currently unserved or underserved. An eligible entity that seeks this money has to commit to at least 2 of the 5 conditions under the law, adopt fiscally sustainable middle mile strategy, which I would hope all of these are checked, but commit to offering non-discriminatory interconnect, identify specific documented and sustainable demand, basically that if they build this, that they have agreements, for example, maybe with last mile providers, that there is an intent here not to just build the middle mile, but that it actually has an impact on unserved areas. And then identify conditions, resources to speed up the project, demonstrated benefits to national security interests. That one will be a hit or miss based on where they're building and the applications of it. Eligible entities must also agree to prioritize connecting to unserved areas or to non-contiguous trust lands and offering of wholesale carrier neutral services at a reasonable rate, basically offering up dark fiber and or lit fiber for wholesale use, and offer interconnection in perpetuity at a reasonable rates and terms. So this is taxpayer money. We want to make sure other entities that see a value in interconnecting or getting wholesale services on the middle mile have the opportunity to do that. Next slide. So this is going to get us to the questions, but maybe I'll just for a moment go back to the BEAD program and provide a little more color on that. The BEAD program, as I said, it's $42 billion, which is directed to states, and it will be formula-based. NTIA is currently in the process of drafting the notice of funding, which will come out May 16th, as I stated. In that, though, there are a few things that we're going to be looking at, right? How states will collaborate with political subdivisions, community organizations, etc. It's critical that states do that for a couple of reasons. One, we want to make sure all the unserved areas are identified, and that's not easy to do. Even for those states that have strong mapping programs, there are still areas in which you will see a carrier claim to serve, but yet the community knows they are not. So having that strong collaboration with political subdivisions and community organizations will actually benefit the state because, again, funding level you get will be based on the number of unserved areas, unserved serviceable locations. Basically, if an area is not served, you get, that goes into the formula. And you want to make sure all your unserved areas are counted. It has a direct financial impact on the amount of money you're going to get. So, one, engaging with these organizations, political subdivisions is key. 2, challenging the FCC maps when they come out. So the FCC maps will be developed over in 22. They will, get the new carrier data in, they'll validate it, and then once they're comfortable, they'll put it out for states or others to challenge the accuracy of the data. And it's important that all of you do that to ensure that you're getting the most money you can get. Because we know carrier data, there's going to be errors. And the only way that those errors can get adjusted is by states, political subdivisions, and other organizations challenging it with, concrete data to show that these areas should be counted as unserved and not served. So with that, there are some questions here. What are state legislators doing now to prepare for IIJ funding? Are they restructuring, looking at how state agencies can best work together? So I'll read these and we can just have an open dialogue if that's easiest. I'm happy to do that. But for example, some states have broadband offices that are sufficiently staffed. Some have broadband offices but have no FTEs. Some have one person. This is a massive undertaking for these programs, and I would just ask the legislators, all of you, to consider the impact of not having a funded broadband office or sufficient support in that broadband offices to do the work that's going to be necessary to connect your citizens. Which is kind of 1 and 2 there. The IAJ calls for states to engage in coordination. This I was just talking about. This is a critical piece. We will help be somewhat prescriptive on what we expect in that engagement. Understanding we need to provide flexibility. Some states do this better than others, et cetera. But we do want to make sure that engagement is done. And what policies can states adopt to eliminate barriers to deployment? What challenges certain policies such as Dig One, streamlined permitting, environmental review, et cetera? This is actually a critical issue, right? I always think of the state permitting offices or local permitting offices. That permitting office isn't just going to get hit by broadband, water, sewer, electric, all of these, the trillions of dollars that were in the bill are infrastructure, and that's going to go through the permitting offices. So states do need to be ready to staff and not create a bottleneck that ends up impacting the deployment and the creation of jobs, et cetera. So these are some of the areas, and I do believe that states would be better off or to consider kind of like an advisory group, might not be the right word for the lawyers, but DOT, your permitting groups, your public service commission, et cetera. The experts that can help minimize the deployment of broadband can be great advisors on this, and they should probably be, part of a team that can educate and inform issues that one person or a broadband office on their own may not be thinking about. And then digital equity. Getting 100% of Americans connected is our goal, but it's just a start. If those citizens that we're trying, those vulnerable populations are not using it, can't afford it, then the physical connection means little. So the digital equity portion of this is critical, right? We know at VTOP, we had a positive, for every dollar invested, I think the analysis showed about a $2.75 return on that dollar investment. Broadband is an engine for economic growth, right? It's by itself, it doesn't do that, but citizens that can create home-based businesses can drive quite a bit of economic revenue for the state, and that's a huge win for the states and for the country. So those are discussion questions. Set it up for you guys. I'm happy to go to a back and forth Q&A now. So if we want to do that, I'll turn it back over to the moderators.
Well, thanks, Doug, for that overview during this webinar. We'd love to get some feedback from the audience. We have some questions we can start with, but for those of you online, we'd rather hear from you. So if you want to throw some questions in the chat function, and we can let Doug answer those. First, I'll get it started. Doug, what technical support can NTIA provide to the states to help them the most efficiently deploy resources to areas that need broadband access?
So we have been doing several things, kind of a little bit of softball. Thank you. We have one, we put out an RFC, a request for comment, which closed on February 4th. We received over 570 comments, industry, states, communities, and we're going through those now on a host of, I think we have 32 questions in the RFC to help feed and educate us on the issues you guys saw, on a host of issues. And the reason that's important is that helps us understand where the issues and the buttons are for the states. We also have been holding listening sessions twice a month, and we'll continue to do that through May. And then those set up usually 3 or 4 questions that states can come into, or communities, et cetera, anybody, and ask questions and give us feedback on those. NTIA also has its State Broadband Leaders Network, which we have all 50 states engaged in that. and 3 territories, in which we meet actually about every other week, and there is an annual meeting coming up in early March. So we have great dialogue with all of your state broadband offices at the state level. We can provide a host of technical assistance, whether it's engineering, financial, et cetera. We are staffing the team to be able to do that once the notices come out. We can help you on mapping. We can put you in contact with other funding sources. Out on the broadbandusa.ntia.gov website, there is a single one-stop shop for all federal funding for broadband. It doesn't have to, and for states. We know your grant programs for our State Broadband Leaders Network. You can go in, pick a state, pick your organization type, and it will help you find funding for broadband. We expect that between BEAD and RDOF and Reconnect and all of the, by orchestrating all the funds, that we will be able to connect 100%. I strongly believe that. But NTIA is here to provide any technical assistance you need. You have, I would assume on the last page, our contact information, yes. And the team, whether you need us to get on a webinar with you, just specific questions of technical assistance, we're always available. And we do this regularly, not just because of the IIJ. We've been doing this for years, providing technical assistance to states and political communities, et cetera.
Excellent, thank you. We appreciate that additional help you can provide the states. I have a hand up from Vermont representative. I don't want to butcher your name, but please have at it.
Okay, Representative Mike Yantachka from Vermont. My question is similar to the one that was put in the chat. How is the data, how is the number of unserved and underserved locations going to be determined? This is particularly crucial in rural areas where you might have a broadband provider going down a main artery, but then there's an awful lot of side roads that don't have very high population densities that have been ignored by the provider because it's too costly to bring broadband. So to what granularity will the number of unserved and underserved locations be determined?
So we all agree that the current maps that the FCC have are not accurate. I don't think I've ever met anybody that would make that argument. The new maps that the FCC are developing are at the location level. So a carrier is supposed to provide data based on the fabric maps that they are building, that whether or not they provide service to a location, the speed that they provide, et cetera. So those side roads that, you know, it's 2 miles off the road and they're not going to do it unless the consumer pays for that themselves, would be deemed unserved. Those locations will be identified. But this also raises the point I was saying. That data is not going to be perfect. And it's up really for states and communities to really be able to challenge the FCC maps. I think they're going to be good maps, they're going to be strong, they're going to be so much better than what we currently have, but they won't be perfect, right? It's carrier data. And carrier data is not perfect. So so one, they will identify the locations that are below 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up by location. So if a carrier is not able to provide service above that speed of the location, it will be deemed unserved. Even if it is served today, but it's served at 10 megabits down, 1 megabits up, they will deem it as unserved. And that will capture everything from below 25.3. That is the intent of those maps. And then they will have a challenge process for everybody to help clean up the maps before we use them for formula, right? NTIA wants to make sure those maps are as accurate as possible before we plug them into the formulas to identify how much each state will get under the $42 billion. The act does give every state a minimum of $100 million. So that's important for a state like Rhode Island that is basically connected, right? The last part of Rhode Island that was connected is Block Island, I think, and they're in the middle of finishing that. So basically Rhode Island's connected. It's an urban state, but they will get at least $100 million. They don't have to worry about connecting citizens, but they can go to the unserved citizens then. So the formula and how much money you get is driven by the number of unserved location. Once you've connected your unserved based on your allocation, you can then use that money to go to the next priority, which is underserved, between 25 and 120. And then if you have money left after that, you can go to the community anchor institutions that are below a gig. So that's kind of how it's laid out in the legislation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Kyle, you had a similar question, so if you'll let us know if that answers what you were looking for or not.
It did. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Brian Boquist, if you're on, you put some abbreviations in there that I don't know how to translate those. So if you can hop on and ask your question to everybody, that'd be great.
Thank you, Senator Brian Boquist here, and I'm in an underserved or unserved area, and the map is wrong already. So I'm with you. We're challenging FCC. That being said, the Homeland Security has some cybersecurity and other grants throughout that came out of the IIJA. All of this is all in the communications realm. And we in Oregon are sort of creating one stovepipe after the next. We're expanding our broadband to address, I think, this formula funding. We're trying to create a new entity to look at the information security stovepipe. We already have a state interoperability. It seems to me that these advisory groups, especially when you get down into the weeds, that the various federal agencies would be encouraging us to work together and across the lines. I don't know whether your agency is doing any work with the CISA, the cybersecurity people on the Homeland Security side, but all this kind of meshes together. And when you start looking at FTE in poorer states, it's sort of hard to give 3 FTE to this stovepipe and 3 to that stovepipe and 4 to that stovepipe. Is there any coordination at your areas or some guidance on what the best practices are, since some of us are starting pretty virgin in this area?
Sure. So yes, there is coordination. It may not be to every single federal agency that received money, because our coordination right now has been focused on with the FCC, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Treasury money, which are the big pots of money for broadband. Those are by far the largest. And we are talking weekly and trying to develop the process to ensure that, one, as much as possible, right? You guys as legislators know, sometimes bills are not always consistent, or language in a bill. So what USDA has to comply with versus what we have to comply with versus FCC on RDOF and Treasury, they're all a little bit different. The key, though, is orchestrating the use of the funding, which is really where you're going, I believe, Brian. And we are working together closely to try to do that. And as our notice of funding comes out with the rules, we will require states to step back and explain to us how they are orchestrating themselves all of these pots of money. So most states have received some form of carrier funding for RDOF, Reconnect, Treasury, the ARPA money, right? Large pots of money there. So we will seek a plan, which is required, from the states on broadband, and we will ask the states how they currently are putting all those pieces together so that we have a strong understanding that they're being used efficiently and not duplicatively, which is key here, right? We don't want overbuild where carriers have already deployed networks and have done that with their own dollars. The intent of this taxpayer capital is to get to those markets that are not attractive from a commercial standpoint or have been left behind because of that. So yes, there is coordination. There are cybersecurity obligations, and we are working with those. There are climate resiliency issues. We're working with NOAA on how to best look at that, right? So there's a host of, as you said, we don't want them to be siloed. We are trying here in Washington to try to coordinate as best we can the various funding streams for the states, and then get the states to think along that same line of how do you start to look at all these pieces on a, like a puzzle, and how do you fit them together? And we will work with states on that once the notices come out as part of the technical assistance.
Excellent. There's a question on the chat from Michael. Is it Knosson? You want to unmute?
Yes, hi.
Please go ahead.
So I know my state is planning to use an allocation of funds from the capital project funds from ARPA to cover its broadband office expenses. But I believe there's also funds allocated in the Infrastructure Investment Act for the same purpose. I was just wondering how many do this. I believe I know of 2 programs that I believe that set aside funds for administration, but just wondering if there's any more.
Yes, the IJA, the BEAD, all of them allow for some administrative costs. I don't remember the percentage, 2%, 5%, but there are percentages for administrative set-asides for states, but it is capped for all of the programs. So that should help, like the BEAD, right? So let me back up for a second. Once a state tells NTIA that wishes to participate in the $42 billion program, NTIA will give, and the state can request up to $5 million for planning. And that will happen right away, even before the FCC maps. So we will issue funding to the state for $5 million to help you start putting together your framework of a 5-year plan. Like what do you conceptually think your plan is going to look like? And then you'll have $5 million to do that. That can be used for staffing and planning and engineering, et cetera. That will create kind of the framework that you'll use to then build your initial full-scale plan once the FCC maps are done. But there will be $5 million for each state upfront for planning, and which can be used for staffing and contracts, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Mr. McSpadden. Spaden, sorry. I knew better.
No worries, no worries. Good to see you all. Just wanted to get a confirmation on the accuracy or detail that's going to be provided in the FCC maps. You mentioned, and certainly the states typically had a very difficult time getting completely accurate information from the telecom providers, whether it's directly or back through FCC and NTIA. Are the new maps going to be at the address point level versus the census block level?
Yes. The problem with the current 477 is, right, one person served in the census block, everything is served in the census block, which means we either overstate or understate depending on how you're interpreting, but it's not good, right? The new will be down to the location level, yes.
Okay.
So they hired a vendor, which is why this is taking a little longer. That vendor is in a protest, but that ends, I think the protest gets wiped out around May 1st. There'll be a decision, let me put it that way. Then they will start to build that fabric map, as they call it, and it is at the location level.
Fantastic. Oregon in 2007 to 2009 had to use aerial imagery to validate the coverage maps. And again, we saw that you'd end up with coverage in a farmer's field, but not for their home. So thank you very much for that area.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do at NTIA, we have the National Broadband Availability Map, which is a private map, meaning there's proprietary data, it's not public facing. We have created the Indicators of Need map, which is a higher level, but we are working with Census and the FCC to give you more of a detailed, informative map that you could use until the FCC maps are out to just help you maybe identify areas of greatest need, not just on access, but on adoption. So we're trying to do that, to bridge a gap. They would not be used for funding, but they would help states and communities target areas of need as they start to think about this.
Thank you for your response. That's great.
Doug, can you talk a little bit more about the different types of sources that funding for matching requirements can come from? We have states and sub-grantees are two, but there are other entities. We're getting lots of pots of money from the federal government now. So where should we be looking?
You should be looking at the current, like the ARPA funding, a lot. I don't have the legislation in front of me, but I apologize for that. But yes, there is in the legislation a list of current legislative funding bills, right? Bills that are laws that you can use money from. and I'm happy to send this to you, I just don't have it at my fingertips, that you can use that funding to cover your match. That's a big win, and it's in the law. So that really will relieve some pressure, and I'm clear that the ARPA is part of that. So, in kind is also important, right? As you start to look at this, right, and you start to build out networks, there are different ways to do it, whether it's, we haven't written it yet, but I think back to the BTOP days, you could use your hours of FTEs, right? So as an administrator of the state, maybe you're helping out, your hours, some of those hours might be able to contribute to in kind. There's different ways to do this, and we'll clarify that in the NOFO, but yes, you can use current legislative funding that's in the law. That I list the different funding streams you can use. It'll be in kind, which are things that contribute to the build out of the network. As I said, water towers are one. You might have poles or rights of way may have a value. California, I've seen that before. They donated land for tower siting, etc. Those things were all contributed. And then, of course, we always take cash. But the carriers can also, right, as part of the bid or the grants that you put out and ask for bids on, might have some kind of obligation that they at least have to come up with some of so they have skin in the game, right? It's not just, here's the money, guys, go. But they might have to put up 15%. Maybe you guys put up 10. There's any scenario you can come up with. We'll be very flexible on that. There's also the right for the Assistant Secretary, Alan Davidson, who just joined us about a month ago, to waive that if there's good showing and good cause, or reduce it. So if you have a poor county, the state doesn't have the money, we would have to see the scenario, but the flexibility is there for the Assistant Secretary of NTIA to waive or reduce the match.
Well, I'm glad to know the federal government still takes cash.
For a little while. I'm not sure that'll end.
What type of service requirements will be placed on potential subgrantees?
So we have an obligation, and we'll work with the FCC on this, and we'll work with the states on this, to identify what we view as a healthy, valid subrecipient, right? Technical capabilities, managerial, financial. There have to be, baseline obligations that entity that bids brings to the table. So we will help establish those in the notice of funding to help states understand what we're looking for. States can always do more, but we're going to set at least the baseline for what we view as subrecipient eligibility requirements. That's in the law, and that's something we will be doing.
Okay. At the end of the slide presentation, there were some questions that came up that Doug answered. Want to see if anyone has any feedback on those out in the audience, or if anyone has any other additional questions.
Reporting requirements. I just saw one pop up as we.
Yes.
So reporting requirements are being established now. Again, the notice of fundings are being drafted now. There are, we've been doing this for months, but you can just imagine all the policy issues that go into a $42 billion program. But reporting requirements will be semi-annual. That is in the law. We are working through now what data will be required from the state. We're considering things like, will the state be obligated to roll up all the reporting from their subgrantees? How will that be done, et cetera? But it is semi-annual, the obligation. It is not quarterly as it was in earlier programs with us.
Okay. Any other questions or feedback on these discussion questions from the audience? Well, we can all hang out here for another 10, 15 minutes, or we can let everyone get back to work. I know it's a busy time for you all in DC, as well as those of us in the legislature. So I want to thank Doug again for sharing his time and expertise on today's webinar. Thanks to the audience for taking time to participate in the webinar. The archive of the webinar will be posted on NCSL's website in the next few days. We appreciate everybody participating. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.
Will do. Thanks.